Good evening. So I am Tim Wallach, trustee of this fine library. It is an honor for me to introduce Richard tonight. We are past business colleagues. Richard, after graduating from Yale and Columbia Law School, first went into the investment world before founding the Octavian Report, a magazine covering foreign policy, money, ideas, the arts, and culture. Richard's thoughtful writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Times of London, among many others. His remarkable new book introduces us to non-Jewish people who risk their lives to save their persecuted neighbors. In the Garden of the Righteous, it chronicles extraordinary acts at a time when the normal choices were stark, the threat immense, and the passive apathy of millions predominated. I was particularly drawn to Richard's book since both of my parents, separately, were similarly saved by courageous acts of others. But for that, I could not be here to introduce Richard. Richard, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. You can all hear me? Yes, great. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's a real honor to be here. First of all, thank you, Tim. I met Tim probably 20 years ago when I was 12, and I learned a lot from, actually, we gravitated to each other. We were partners at a firm, and I learned a lot from Tim about not only what we did, but also about being a ethical business person and someone who had a lot of interests, and he was amazing to work with and has been a great friend, and I really appreciate him arranging this event. And I also wanted to thank the library, which is an extremely special place for me. When the book, we've had a number of events around the book. This is the one I was probably the most excited about because I'm a native, lifelong Upper East Sider, and this library is a very, very important place for my family. My children came here when they were little. They used to go to the children's library. My son, who's a first year at Yale, when he comes home, he still comes here to do his work or just to read, and it's just been a really special place for our family. So it's really wonderful, and I think to have the corner bookstore here as well. I mean, it's like the trifecta. So that's really it really is an amazing place, and I've been in those seats. So to be up here now is really fabulous. So I thought what I'd do is just talk a little bit about why, the origin of the book, and give you a sense of some of the stories in the book, and a little bit of what I learned about, why people did these amazing acts of courage. I mean, I think the people in my book, when they say, he who saves one life saves the world, and part of that is the descendants, right? I think there's probably 1 million people alive today, something close to that, just based on the 10 stories in my book, and I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of those descendants. So like Tim was saying, these acts of kindness, they just echo down through the generations. So the story, like why people often ask me why I wrote this book or when it started, and there's probably a few different answers to that, but I think the right answer, but there's not. I started thinking about this book actually when I was in college, and the Holocaust Memorial Museum opened on the Mall in Washington, and I don't know, many of you may have been through that exhibit, but it's an enormously challenging thing to go through. The artifact, you see, the cattle cars, and one image that stayed with me, and as I've talked to people about the book all over the country, it seems to be the thing that stays with a lot of people is what's on the right, which is this pile of shoes from concentration camp survivors. And if you look really closely, you see that a lot of them are children's sizes. So, of the 6 million who perished, 1.5 million were children. And so at the time, I was in college, and this was a very overwhelming experience for me. Even though I actually, my family's been in this country for many, many generations, so we weren't directly affected by the Holocaust, but it was extraordinarily traumatic. And I came out into a room that they had at the time a very small exhibit of people that tried to do something to help people during the Holocaust. And I remember I immediately gravitated to the picture on the left, which is actually one of the pictures on the cover of the book. And this guy, whose name was Alexander Schmorell, he was about at my age at the time, so he was maybe a little bit older. He's a medical student at the University of Munich, and he was part of something you may have heard of called the White Rose. And the group on the right are other members of the White Rose. The girl in the middle, her name is Sophie Scholl, and her brother is there as well, Hans Scholl. Hans was really the founder of the group, and this was a group of very idealistic students who tried to foment an uprising against the Nazis, a student uprising. They started initially by circulating leaflets to other students, but also they would look up just people in the phone book and they would leave them all around. And Schmorell on the left actually wrote the second leaflet, which is one of the first, if not the first, document that tried to publicize the Holocaust. And he said, at this point, 300,000 Jews have been killed in the most bestial way. And so they were, over the course of a year, they circulated a number of leaflets. There was graffiti that appeared in Munich. They were in touch with students all over. But one day they were at the University of Munich, and they went to the top of a staircase, and Sophie realized that she had a lot of leaflets that were left, and she threw them down an atrium, and they kind of like floated down like snowflakes, and a maintenance man who was an ardent Nazi locked the doors, turned them in. They were put on, 3 of them they were put on trial, the other 3 were captured soon after, and Hitler personally sent his favorite judge down, and within days they were summarily executed. And Hans had this famous line right before he was executed. He said, "Long live freedom." But his sister Sophie, during the trial, said something. She said, everybody thinks the way we do. They're just afraid to say it. And of course, this was completely not true. Right, and actually after the war, Hitler had a secretary who was about her age, and she was walking and saw a memorial to Sophie, because today, if you go to Germany, they're heroes, right, and everyone knows who they are, and there are more schools named after them than I think anybody. And she saw this, and then she saw that they kind of had around the same birthday, and she said, I actually had no excuse for what I did, right, and so. So this story stayed with me for a long time, and I almost wrote my thesis on it in college until I realized I don't know German. It wasn't possible. But I wrote this story up for the New York Times on the 75th anniversary of their execution. And the story went completely viral. It was trended to the top 10 that day. It was shared widely on the internet. At the time, it was when the Parkland shooting had happened, and there was a lot of conversation about, heroic young people. And I look, the internet's a very dark place, particularly when it comes to things like anti-Semitism and hate. And so when you write something, you look for comments, and I've written stuff about the history of gold and gotten scary responses. There was not one negative comment, not one anti-Semitic comment, not one not anywhere on the internet, on Twitter. And I looked, and it was all people that were inspired by these stories. So I started writing them up, and I wrote up a few others for the Wall Street Journal and the LA Times, and for the Daily Beast, and I had the same response. They were widely shared. I had a story about the King of Morocco went to #2 on Reddit, which is seen by hundreds of millions of people. The only thing that trended higher was a girl taking a cardboard cutout of Danny DeVito to the prom. So, but a little fun fact. But there was something about these stories, right, that really seemed to resonate, and they're very unknown. And so. Just a minute on that, maybe, because why is it that they're unknown? Pretty much, everyone knows the story of Wallenberg, right? And then after 1994, people know the story of Schindler. And actually, I can actually, when you do research, you can tell when that movie came out, because all of a sudden, to the extent there were articles, the person became went from being the Portuguese Wallenberg to the Portuguese Schindler. But other than those two, and maybe the story of Denmark, things are really, really, unknown. And there are a few reasons for that. But some of which I think are actually fair, and some of which I think are just an accident of history, and some of which go into some very dark parts of our own nature. But so like right after the war, and maybe this is a little bit like why the media, everything is negative, right? You never see positive stories. There's something in us that wants to know about that. So most of the focus right after the war were on the evil, like the perpetrators, the collaborators, the people who stood by. On the left is a picture of the Milgram experiments, which was a study done at Yale about why people followed instructions. There were the Stanford Milgram, Stanford prison experiments, and so that was kind of the focus. There was one study I'll get into in a moment about that was done of rescuers, but very, very little work. The rescuers themselves, which I'll talk about a little later, were very silent for a variety of reasons. The main reason being a sense of modesty about what they did that was really actually quite sincere and really remarkable. And then there was, from the first generation of survivors, many of whom had not been rescued and had been through camps, a kind of strong feeling that to talk about survivors, to talk about the rescuers, is to kind of distort the record, and I that's changed, that view, but that's the part that I think is legitimate, because when you think about it, so even though Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, from its founding, one of its core missions has been to honor the righteous among the nations and those who save non-Jews who save Jews. Now they have very strict criterion, but they've still recognized 27,000 people, right? And that sounds like a big number, but it's the population of Europe at the time was 500 million. So to use maybe a topical example, given what's going on with the Knicks right now, but if you filled up Madison Square Garden with a representative sample of the European population at the time, you'd have one person who was the righteous among the nations. So, they again have strict criterion. So, there are lots of people who, they were killed doing this, so we don't know about them. They were unsuccessful, or even people, to me, Primo Levi talked about a man when he was imprisoned who brought him soup every day. And he said that this man, whose name was Lorenzo, saved his life because he knew somebody cared about him. So to me, that man is a righteous also. So there were, other people that did things like that. But even if you multiply by 100, right, and say, you're still talking about a vanishingly small percentage of people who did that. So the next generation, sort of starting in the late 60s, there was more of an effort, and my friend Abe Foxman from the ADL was one of kind of the spearheads of this, to try to bring focus to people. A lot of people have been hidden as children, wanted more focus on this. And the reason, I think there's a few reasons why I think it's really important, okay? So first of all, I think these are some of the greatest heroes and the greatest stories in all of human history. I say that I have a degree in ancient history, and I've studied history of all periods. These are incredible stories, and I think we owe them a debt of gratitude to all of these people to tell the stories, not just people who are Jewish, but anybody who's like a human being, because it was just this is the best in us, right? And there's a historical injustice, I think, that everybody knows who Hermann Goering is, and everybody knows who Heinrich Himmler is, but people don't know who Aristides de Souza Mendes is, who saved probably 30,000 people. They're not known, and I think that needs to be changed. And then I think there are real lessons that we can learn from why people did this. There've been 40 genocides since World War II. This is still going on. There's horrific war crimes going on right now in Ukraine. There's 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps. So we're not, the Holocaust, I think, was a uniquely terrible moment and a uniquely terrible thing, but there are other bad things going on. And it's important, I think, to learn lessons that, what made people do this, what made communities do this. And I think it's also important, and there's people in this room that know this much better than I do, but
Going back to my own experience at the Holocaust Museum, and I was already a college student, and I found it difficult. I have a friend who's a documentarian, makes documentary films about the Holocaust, who said that the stories of rescue are a bit like a banister you can hold on to when you look at the Holocaust, right? It's very difficult to think about what happened. 6 million Jews killed in like horrific ways, hundreds of thousands of other people, 50 million people dead during World War II. And I think particularly for children as well, my daughter, when she was in middle school, read a book called Number of the Stars that talks about rescue. And I think like this is, so especially for children, but even for a general audience, it's very important to, it's a way of getting at this. And I remember, during 9/11, when 9/11 happened, they brought Mr. Rogers out of retirement, and they asked him, like, how do we talk to children about what happened? And I remember he said, we need to look at the helpers. You need to look at the policemen and the firemen. And so, these were like analogously, the helpers. And I think that's really an important part of how we need to start talking about the Holocaust with people. And there, again, like, this is obviously a very educated audience. I was on the radio, and one of the interviews I did, the first question I was asked, and the guy was really like wanted these stories told and was very simple. He said, this was in Arizona. He said, like, can you explain what the Holocaust is, right? So, which I did, but he anyway. So the question about why people did this, I'll spend I just like a minute on this. By the way, this guy on the left is. Daniel Trochme, who was at a town called Le Chambon that I'll briefly talk about later. He was his cousin was a pastor of a town in France that rescued 5,000 people, including 3,500 Jewish children, and they were committed to nonviolence. And he volunteered to be like a housemaster, so like in Harry Potter, and he took care of like little children. He was about 30, and he ended up being part of the one roundup that happened in this town and died. And even after he was arrested, he was writing home to his parents, I found my calling. My calling is to take care of children and to protect them. And so like this is, again, like an amazing human being. So I mentioned earlier there was very little work done on what made people do this. There was one study that was done by Holocaust survivors who were also Freudian analysts, husband and wife, and they deemed it the altruistic personality. The only thing they found was how you were disciplined as a child was what was the only correlation. If your parent flew off the handle and hit you and punished you for no good reason, that correlated with not rescue. But if you were in a loving home with like rational punishment, anyway, they're Freudian, so this was what they focused on. But I would extrapolate from that, just from my own, having gone through hundreds of these stories, that there definitely is a correlation. The number one thing that was consistent among almost all of the rescuers was a strong role model as a child, often a parent or both parents, who did a couple of things. One is probably a little bit more obvious, which is they not only taught them you shouldn't hate, you shouldn't be bigoted, but exposed them to others, but also really inculcated this belief that we're all the same and that we need to look out for each other and we need to look out for and if you see somebody being bullied, you should stand up for them. The other thing they did is they generally came from very loving homes. Where their interests were valued, and this correlates usually with strong self-esteem. And when you think about it, a lot of these rescuers, I mean, they were quite eccentric in normal times. Like they would have been considered to do what they did, to risk their lives, and to do it when everybody else around you was not doing this, right, is a bit extreme. And you have to have significant self-esteem and significant belief in your own moral compass and your own decision making, and so that was also definitely part of it. I say this in a library, educational achievement had no correlation. In some ways it was negatively correlated. The Wannsee conference, I think almost everyone there, if not everyone, had a PhD. So that did not, but a belief in something greater than yourself, which we can talk about religion and its role, but like religion by far was the most of whatever kind, whether it was Protestantism or Catholicism or Orthodox or Muslim. That was the single most important, but also things like liberal democracy or nonviolence. These were also people who rescued tended to believe in something much bigger than themselves. And when in terms of like religion, it was people who really internalized the teachings of things like love thy neighbor as thyself, which was on the top of the temple in the Protestant temple where this guy lived, or I think the parable of the Good Samaritan saved more Jews than anything else in Europe. People in creative professions definitely were more likely, and people who had careers that were international. But again, people who were attracted to the church or like the foreign service for hierarchical reasons, that tended to actually go in the other direction. The other thing I just would say about rescuers in general, and it's almost eerie, they use almost the exact same language across hundreds of stories where people say, I didn't do anything exceptional. I did what anybody else would do. I just did the decent thing. I mean, these are the same words that they use. And so there was this universal modesty, and they really meant it, because like you cannot have, it was not a false modesty at all. And if you talk to even people who've been involved with rescue now, there is a like, it continues to this day. So that was also another reason why rescue went kind of unnoticed, because people didn't talk about it. But there were other reasons. Many of them, if you read the book, you'll see many people suffered because of this. They really had a very difficult time because of what they did. Many of them were punished. Just because the Allies won, anti-Semitism didn't end. So when people went back home, many of them were sort of attacked for what they did. Oskar Schindler had rocks thrown at him in Germany. He was in litigation because he hit a guy who insulted him for helping Jews during the war. So people said, like, why'd you help the Jews? And you also could have brought like the Nazis to punish us. Behind the Iron Curtain, there was also there was institutional anti-Semitism, and to be a rescuer was very dangerous. There were many people who had the righteous medal in their drawer, so you could be put in jail for it. It was often an assumption if you were a rescuer, you worked with the Allies and were anti-communist. So it wasn't until after the Berlin Wall fell that whole series of stories started to come out. And then I think like the other thing, the reason why a lot of people hated the rescuers is going back to what Hitler's secretary had said. They're inconvenient, right? So it's very hard to say I couldn't have done anything when you have someone who lives next door to you who did something, right? So it completely puts the lie to that whole thing. And what we'll see is that when an entire community comes together, actually could be really successful. So that's a little bit of sort of the theory of what and some of the what I learned from writing the book. I'll give you just briefly some of the stories in there, just like a high level cliff note version of some of the people. But I mentioned Aristides Sousa Mendes earlier. People ask me often who is my favorite rescuer, and I don't answer the question because it's like asking who's your favorite child. But he would be one of them, if not. And actually, the Christian Science Monitor called him the breakout star of the book. And he was really so he was a aristocratic Portuguese lawyer by education. He was a twin. His brother was the successful one. He became foreign minister. He was kind of a by the book, really efficient, very impressive guy. Sousa Mendes was also a talented diplomat, but he was much more of like the bon vivant, sort of great entertainer. He had amazing people in their home. He was Einstein came and talked about math with his child. He had 15 children. He lived all over the world. He was posted at one point in Berkeley, California. So he had 2 children that were Americans, and he was a great humanitarian. He was a devout Catholic, although he believed he was descended from conversos. And he found himself in Bordeaux in June of 1940 when the Nazis invaded France, and this led to probably the greatest mass exodus in history, as 5 million people fled south from Paris this was the worst traffic jam in history, and you had the Luftwaffe overhead bombing people, and it was just a humanitarian catastrophe. And at the same time, Salazar, who was the dictator of Portugal, who was a very Machiavellian character, very complicated, he actually didn't believe in a one-party state. He was more of a corporatist authoritarian, but what his main focus was, he was sympathetic to the fascists, and he did not want Portugal to get pulled into the war, and so Spanish neutrality was critical to him. And so he put out something called Circular 14 to all the diplomats that said basically no refugees into Portugal or Spain, or across the Spanish border, and particularly no Jews. And he actually had grown up with Sousa Mendes and kind of resented him because Sousa Mendes was in a kind of a wealthy aristocratic family. So this crowd of refugees appeared outside of the consulate, and there was Sousa Mendes went outside and he met a young rabbi who had a large family, and he was from Poland, but he'd been in Antwerp, and Sousa Mendes had been posted in Antwerp, and he started talking to him, and he said, look, I've sent all my kids, except my two oldest, back to Portugal, so the embassies they have consulates kind of empty, why don't you come and spend the night? So he came in and the rabbi came and he spent the night, and Sousa Mendes had already quietly defied Circular 14. He'd been reprimanded for giving a couple of visas to people that were kind of desperate, and as you needed visa to get out. And by the way, all these people had gone to every other consulate, right? Everybody slammed the door, including the United States, which we can talk about as well, the role of the United States. And at the end of the night, Sousa Mendes said, look, I think I can help you and your family. I can give you visas. And the rabbi said to him, look, I can't take visas for myself and leave all these other people outside. I can't do that. And Sousa Mendes had this very dramatic moment where he took to his bed for 2 days, and he later said he experienced a nervous breakdown. And then he got up out of the bed dramatically, and he said, he came to outside and he said, I'm going to give a visa to every single person who needs one, regardless of who you are or what your religion is. And he did that. And over 3 weeks, he gave out thousands of visas. We don't know exactly how many people he saved. He saved many, many, many poor refugees, but among the people he saved were Salvador Dali, most of the Habsburg family, the Rothschilds, Paul Rosenberg, who was Picasso and Matisse's art dealer, Jean-Michel Franck. I opened the book with the escape of H.A. and Margaret Ray with the manuscript of Curious George, and he saved them and the manuscript. And this happened over 3 weeks. We're pretty sure he was the largest single rescue by any individual during the Holocaust. And for his heroism, he was summoned back to Portugal, fired. He was had his pension stripped. He ended up going through his entire life savings. His children had to leave the country. They couldn't get jobs. His wife died prematurely. He had a stroke. He died prematurely. There was a moment where he was eating in the Jewish soup kitchen. He would take no money from anybody who had rescued him. And in all honesty, people didn't even know who he was, until much later. But he went there, and it was a testimony by a teenager, a boy, and he saw this man come in very elegant diplomatic attire that was threadbare. And he said to him, they had a part that was nicer than the part for the refugees, and the kid went over to him, who was Jewish, and he said, you and your family should go to this nicer area. This is for refugees. And he said, we're all refugees. And he also had this great line where he said, I would rather stand with God against man than with man against God. So ironically, later in the war, when the Allies were winning, Salazar became an ally of the Allies. He became an ally of ours during the Cold War, and took a lot of credit for Portugal being this haven. If you've seen the movie Casablanca, right? Everybody wants to get to Lisbon, so that also actually happened. That turn happened during Sousa Mendes, and he was quite frustrated by it. But anyway, so that's just a fairly unknown story, and yet again, here just 30,000 people. That means there's several 100,000 people alive because of this one man who paid a really difficult price for it. Totally different story. I'll go a little quicker. But this is a rescue that happened in the circus. So like again, I looked for all different kinds of rescue, different places in Europe, different reasons people did this. I mean, I learned actually a lot about the history of the circus, which is a multicultural, kind of kooky art form. It was something the Nazis actually took quite seriously, unlike sort of degenerate art, and so they really valued it. And so they went out. Because part of the multiculturalism was there were a lot of Jews in the circus, and there were a lot of Jewish-owned circuses 100 years ago. And one of them, and again, these are dynastic, right? So this family, the Lorch family, they were renowned for, if you've ever seen the act where somebody lies on their back, they sort of like pedal a person and like a somersault. It's called an Icaran act. That was like their big thing. And so they were actually in here in New York at Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey Circus, and if you can see the poster, it's maybe a little hard to read. They were the highest paid act of any circus act in the world. And what happened was then in the 30s, the Nazis started cracking down on Jews in the circus, and the you see on the right the girl in the middle, her name was Irene Danner. And she was a member of the Lorch family, and her mother is actually the one on the right, and her father, who wasn't Jewish, is the guy with his shirt off. She came to this family, the Altoffs, and they were like circus royalty. This was like 9th generation, and everybody knew the Altoffs. And the guy on the left is Adolf Altoff, who was the ringmaster, and on the right is his wife, Maria, who was performed in they both performed in the circus. She's with their elephants. And the girl knocked on his door. He had a traveling circus, and when it came to Darmstadt, where she was based, and she came to the door and said, "Can you help me?" And he said, "Of course." And he put her in the circus, actually. So she under an assumed name. So and then as the crackdown continued, he ended up taking in her entire family, and then she actually fell in love with the guy with his arm like that was a clown, and they ended up having 2 children. So there were like 6 or 7 family, depending on how you count, because the father was really, he was Aryan, but was going to be, he had gone into hiding with them. So, and they would travel all around Germany, and the Gestapo, the Germans loved this circus, and every stop, it was subject to Gestapo inspection, and Adolf Altoff was incredible at like telling stories about like dancing with bears in Russia, and they served brandy, and they would distract the Germans, and then they would perform, and you had these members of the Gestapo in the audience watching, having no idea they're watching Jews, and they survived the entire war, and so that's an amazing story, right? And very briefly, Greece, it's a sort of little known fact, but the outcome for the Greek Jews was the worst in all of Europe. Over 90% of Greek Jewry was wiped out. There's a third kind. So people know Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. Most of the Greek Jews were Sephardic, and they lived in Salonika. There's a third kind of Jew called a Romanot, who are in the south. And another thing that comes out of my book is that if you were the Italians, it's a long conversation, but if they generally didn't really get the anti-Semitism, and if you were in an area that was occupied by the Italians, they didn't do roundups. So the southern part of Italy, where the Romanot Jews were, who were very integrated in, they had Greek names, they had been there since the time of Alexander, had fought for Greece, they were very close to their neighbors, was also in the Italian zone. So there wasn't really a problem for them until 1943, ironically, when the US and the British invaded Italy and Mussolini fell, and the Germans came down and occupied the north. And the man in the middle is Archbishop Damaskinos, and this is the chief of police of Athens, and they saved thousands of Jews. And actually, all of civil society of Athens, they basically signed a very famous letter. Damaskinos was sort of the John Hancock, first person to sign it, and he's the only member, head of an organized church in Europe to have formally protested the Holocaust. On the left, so there's this other book out right now called Spare, by a prince named Harry. And the corner bookstore actually put my book in the window and took his out, not intentionally, but it happened at the same time. This is his great-grandmother, Princess Alice. And so this is Charles's grandmother, Philip's mother. And I actually have something coming out for the coronation, but she's in my book. And amazing story was related to basically every, her aunt was the Tsarina, her great-grandmother was Queen Victoria, her cousin was the Kaiser. She rescued a family of 3 Jews during, and did many other great things like running an orphanage for 17,000 children. She rescued a family of 3 in her palace across the street from the Gestapo during the occupation of Athens. And she's actually buried in Israel for a different reason, which you can read my book about. But she's been honored as a righteous among the nations. And anybody who watched The Crown, they kind of make her out to be like a kook, but she actually was like a fascinating hero. And Charles is really kind of obsessed with her rightfully. And there is I have an article coming out about a tribute, like kind of a very subtle tribute he's making during the coronation in next weekend or 2 weeks to her because she was amazing. This is Gino Bartoli. I don't know if anybody knows this story. This is fascinating to me. He was one of the most famous athletes in Europe at the time. He won the Tour de France in 1938. This would be like the equivalent of like LeBron James or Lionel Messi or Michael Jordan, and is particularly in Italy where they're just completely obsessed with at the time in particular with cycling. And he was a devout Catholic. Sports were really important to Mussolini. So the Italian soccer team had won the World Cup. They had done really well at the Olympics. Primo Carnero was the heavyweight champion of the world. They all dedicated their victories to Mussolini. Bartoli refused. So he was not beloved by the regime even before the war. And then when the war broke out, they let him actually be a bicycle messenger so he could stay in shape. And then, as I mentioned earlier, 1943 was really the date when things became very dire, including for any Italian Jew and any foreign Jew that was north of, from the demarcation line was kind of right south of Rome. So if you were in the north, you had a problem. And Bartoli did a couple of things. So he hid this family of 4, and actually at one point their cousin, in a basement of an apartment he owned in the center of Florence. And he also hid another Jew and a Romani man during the occupation. If they had caught him, it doesn't matter how famous he was, he would have been shot. And then, the church is complicated, right? But in the north, there was something called the Assisi Underground, which was spearheaded by the Archbishop of Geneva and of Florence and the Bishop of Assisi, and they hid Jews and partisans all over, and particularly in Assisi, in cloisters and monasteries and convents. And Bartoli was a courier for them, and he basically would ride all over the north. And he was the only person, right, who had an excuse to ride hundreds of miles and physically could ride hundreds of miles. And he would, inside his bicycle, he had false papers that saved lives. And and he would they'd stop him at the checkpoint, and he'd say, don't touch my bike because it's perfectly calibrated, and people are like, don't touch Bartoli's bike, you're gonna cost him the Giro d'Italia and whatever. And then he never told anybody except his son. And there were rumors, and the Jewish community knew about it, and he would say things like, look, I want to be remembered as a cyclist. I don't want to be I didn't do anything during the war. Other people, and he had been actually at one point arrested and almost tortured. And again, this modesty, and he had every platform to talk about it, and he was a national hero. And he said, there's some medals they give you for winning bicycle races, and then there are other medals you get in the next life, and they're pinned to your soul. So Bartoli. People may know this story. I'll go a little quicker. This is Sugihara, who was a Japanese diplomat. People may wonder, why was a Japanese man sent to open a consulate in Lithuania where there are no Japanese people? Why is there a consulate there? It's because he was really an intelligence operative, and he was there to monitor troop movements. And the Japanese believed that the Russians and the Germans would go to war with each other, which was correct, and that's why he was there. He was a Russia hand. He spoke fluent Russian. He'd lived in Harbin in Manchuria for a long time. So again, someone who'd spent a lot of his life outside of Japan, which was unusual. And he also had the same experience as Susan Mendez. One day he looked outside his embassy, and his sister-in-law actually took this picture. She had come with them to help look after the children. And these are refugees that lined up there. And he, people needed exit visas. So you could go across the Soviet Union, but you needed a place to go. And so he spent days writing thousands of these until the last moment when he had to leave, and he was on the train platform, and his hand would it's like calligraphic script. And the guy on the left, in the interest of time, I'll go quickly, but he was a Dutch businessman who was honorary consul, and he kind of worked in tandem with him because he gave visas to Curacao. And then you could get if you had a Curacao visa, which actually you didn't technically even need, but then you could take that and a Japanese visa and get out. And so they saved thousands of people. And I actually have had the experience of meeting, I think there's 6 people that I know personally before I wrote this book that have told me that they are direct descendants of people that were rescued by Sugihara. This is Irena Sendler. This was the hardest chapter to write. She was 4'11", 29 years old. She was a social worker. Her father had been a doctor that took care of Jews and died when she was 8 from catching typhus from poor Jews that he took care of. She was a incredible person. She was a social worker. And when the famous picture on the left you may have seen of the Warsaw Ghetto, which was actually was part of the report that was created by Jürgen Stroop, who was in charge of liquidating the ghetto. So they were actually quite proud of this picture of the Nazis. She was able to get to make it was a long story about her, but she basically went in and out of the Warsaw Ghetto and saved 2,500 infants, children, and teenagers, and with a group of people inside the ghetto, most of whom were Jewish, and outside the ghetto who were not Jewish, who then hid the children. And 90+% of her network were young women, and many of them got killed. And most of the hellscape of when you think of the worst places in the Holocaust, the death camps and the ghetto was in Poland, and she was right there. She's the one who gave, if you know the story of Jan Karski, who witnessed all of this and then reported to FDR and Anthony Eden. They asked her, the underground, to give him the tour of the ghetto because she was so good at going in and out. She dressed like a nurse, and so she saved all of these children. She kept their names in a jar, hoping their parents would come get them, but of course they didn't afterwards. And then she's one of these people that couldn't tell anybody what she did because she was Polish. So her story came out many, many years later, but she was amazing. I'll spend 1 minute on just community rescue. So this is Denmark. People know this story, but usually there's the famous story about the king on the left who was related to Alice actually, about that he wore the Star of David, during it's not a true story because the Danes would not permit the Star of David to be have any of the Jews wear it. So from the day the Nazis didn't want trouble in Denmark, and the entire Danish population from the day of the occupation basically said, you're not touching our Jews. And there were about 7,200 Jews there. They were called the Viking Jews, and many of them had been there since the Inquisition. And then eventually a sequence of events happened where a German, who was a Nazi but not an anti-Semite, heard about that there was going to be a roundup, tipped off the Danish government, and virtually the entire population of Denmark rode across the straits to Sweden. The 7,200 Jews and 800 non-Jewish family members of Jews. The couple there were resistance operatives. The man on the left was actually a Olympic rower, and he Knud Christensen, and he literally rode people across the straits. He actually ended up in New York at the end of his life. He was remember they had all these stores on Lexington Avenue that he was a clock maker and repairman, and he used to actually repair the clock in front of the Sherry Netherland. But he saved as part of as did most Danes, and then about 500 Danish Jews were captured and they were sent to Theresienstadt. Every week, the Danish government called and said, we're checking on our Jews. How are they doing? Sent them food, medicine. They came and inspected the camp. And so all but 50 actually survived the war. And so 99% of the Danish Jews survived. And when they came back, there were all kinds of stories. People had watered their plants. They looked after their pets. They took care of their businesses. And so Denmark is, well-known, amazing story. But this is another story that I mentioned earlier. This is this town in France. That's the pastor and his wife, André Trochme and Magda, and their 4 children. Incidentally, the girl, the oldest, was a teenager at the time. She's still, I interviewed her, and she emailed me today. She's 95, has like total recall. She's like, no. Our walls were not painted yellow. They were painted kind of an orange color. So but they, interviewing this children of rescue is actually a very fascinating topic. But they saved, Protestant village, descendants of Huguenots. So they had been subject to persecution themselves for centuries. They had a long tradition of bringing refugees there. Today there are, I understand, Ukrainians and Afghans there. And they saved 5,000 people, 3,500 Jewish, mostly children. And they gave them, I interviewed a number of the survivors, they gave them really as close as you could get to the semblance of normal childhood. So you see them, like, this is like one of many pictures in the Holocaust Museum. They had, they even had a Hanukkah party, but they were all in different houses, and they went to school, and they had a primary school, and there was up to college, and they also were a hotbed of a place where they would take people across the border to Switzerland. It's very clear Camus he was in the next village, was when he wrote The Plague, was very inspired by what was going on there. Very briefly, because one of the issues, I wrote an article for the Journal about this. Places like Denmark, Albania, majority Muslim country, poorest country in Europe, the only country with more Jews at the end of the war than at the end, 100% survival rate. Why is it that some places kind of had this happen? And I think there are a few things that were specific then, which is like places that didn't have any tradition of religious bigotry, places where people stood together as one, and refused to permit discrimination, and where there was also, like, for example, this Besa is a culture of hospitality in Albania, and they would rather die than have someone who is a guest in their home or in their country be captured, and so it had been a place where Jews, Christians, and Muslims had lived since the Roman times together peacefully. So there were so things came together, but there's also, and this is where I think there are real lessons to learn that are relevant today, right? Because I don't think we're living through the Holocaust. I don't think we're going to, but how can we make the world a better place, and how can you prevent terrible things from happening? And there was one of the rescuers, because rescue was an extreme behavior, right? And there was a rescuer in Holland who said, look, we were the tip of the spear, but what made us successful, and Holland had a mixed record, but it was better than most places, said what made us successful was that the people around us sort of sympathized and looked the other way, or they gave people like the guy with the soup with Primo Levi. And so when you create a society where the majority of people or a community say, hatred is wrong, bullying, that's why I think this anti-bullying campaign, people make fun of it, but I think it's really real, and it's very important to do this with children. When you have a community where the majority of people feel that persecuting people, and I say that in even an individual, the way they talk about bullying is wrong, and people will stand up against it, that's how you ended up having communities like Denmark and Albania, and that's why education about this is so important. I want to open up for a Q&A, but I can't resist one last thing, which is if anyone's seen Transatlantic, this is Varian Fry, who's amazing. I liked the show. It's 80% made up, and I I say that because the people who made it actually have said that on, and they acknowledge that, and so I'm happy to spend as much. I mean, even the breed of the dog is not correct, but what triggered actually the rescue, which is totally left out of it, was this picture of Leon Feuchtwanger, who was a very famous writer, and Eleanor Roosevelt saw this picture and said, "We have to do something," and so she sent the only person who would go was Fry, who was like this, He went. He thought he was going to be there for 3 weeks. They gave him a few $1,000s, and he put on like his Brooks Brothers suit, and he went off. And he was there 13 months. And this is him. Article 19 of the agreement with Vichy said they would turn over, surrender on demand. Anybody the Nazis wanted, the Vichy government would turn over. So, as people know, many of the intelligentsia of Europe were rescued by Fry and his group, including many of the most famous artists. He's here with most of the well-known surrealists. Many of the German writers. Alfred Barr at the MoMA had made a list of artists, and Thomas Mann had made a list of writers, and there were political dissidents, et cetera. And they got out like 2,500 people, not all of whom were famous. This is him with the Chagalls at the Chagall studio. And I only want to just say one thing about the movie. The man behind them is a guy named Hiram Bingham, who's briefly in the show, who was basically, there was a bill entered into Congress 2 months ago to honor people like Susan Mendez, to give them the Congressional Medal of Honor. So diplomats who tried to help. There's one American, and it's him. And his father was the discoverer of Machu Picchu, Hiram Bingham III, who is a terrible anti-Semite and bigot. A very talented guy. So it's even more amazing that Bingham, he ended up in Marseille in 1940, and you can see some of the names of the people that he and Fry, rescued, and he visited internment camps and wrote up a report. And so what happened to him? He got punished. He got sent to Argentina, and then when he started to say, "Hey, there's a lot of Nazis coming to Argentina and a lot of gold," the State Department sent him to Cuba, and bounced him out of the State Department. In the movie, they have Fry leaving the Villa Airbel with the Chagalls. That didn't happen. What really happened is we put pressure, the State Department, on the Vichy government to expel Fry. So he was forcibly expelled. His passport was revoked, and he was taken to the border and put on a train. Only Fry has been honored by Yad Vashem, and not even the State Department has honored Bingham. The retirees of the State Department, they had a ceremony. And these are other people who were part of this group, that most of whom were left out of the film. So guy in the upper left, I spoke to him. His name was Justus Rosenberg. He became a very famous professor. He was 100. Danny Benedict. So Mary Jane Gold, if you've seen it, is the one on the right. But they combined her with this woman, Miriam Davenport, who really was the one who was much more active. Hirschman in the middle, he did not have an affair with Mary Jane Gold, and he became a famous economist. Charles Foster on the left, who married like 8 different Jewish women to get them out, had this crazy career where he became a movie actor, and he was, dated Hedy Lamarr, and like totally left out of this film. One last quick thing, which this is the one story I just want to point out. One thing. This girl on the left was rescued on the death march by 10 British POWs, and I mention this story for 2 reasons. Not every rescue, it's great. There were people like Susan Mendez who saved 30,000 people. This was the reverse. This was 10 people, 3 weeks from, they were interned, and they knew that the Russians were coming. So they were 3 weeks away from liberation, and they made a decision to risk their lives to save this girl who had run off from the death march and was being pursued by the SS. And they hid her in a barn for 3, and this is them later. She tracked them down like 20 years later, and they were reunited. And the other thing I remember about them that I found really interesting is part of the reason they stayed, actually, the family, when the Germans came, was the father had been tormented by the Russians. And he was more afraid of the Russians than the Germans. And when she was found in a barn by these British, there was also a Russian group, and they refused to take her. And so that is just something really interesting about that, and the way different cultures reacted. And it wasn't even, these guys, as she said when she petitioned Yad Vashem, she said, if any one of them and these were not educated, these were young guys, and they knew they were about to be free. If any one of them had said no, they couldn't have rescued her, and it wasn't even, when you read their testimony, it wasn't even a question. So anyway, I hope you found this interesting, and I hope it piques your interest in the book, and also in the many stories that are not in the book, because we learn new ones all the time, and there's 27,000. You can find it at Yad Vashem and many more. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to. Sorry, I went on and droned on probably too long, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take them. Thank you.
I've always been shocked about Bulgaria.
Yeah.
Why Bulgaria?
What about Bulgaria?
Why? I mean, it's in a funny neighborhood. None of the other.
The Bulgaria, I've had debates about Bulgaria because it is true. So the Bulgarians saved all of their Jews. Most of them, yes. But they did not. So in Greece, they occupied Thrace, which is like, and they turned over the Jews there. So I think it was a bit of a stain on the record. They also, like the southern Greeks, it was really, the king was sort of on the fence, and it was a mix of some people in parliament, and then the church there took a very strong view the way the southern Greek church did. So also Orthodox, to try to protect the Jews. So that's why that happened. But yeah, it's a bit of an outlier, but they were, it was, you have to give them credit for protecting their own community.
Yeah. This is not a question, it's a statement. I'm the son of rescuers. My parents, as a young married couple in The Hague, Netherlands, were part of the resistance, and they did a number of things, including being involved in various operations against the Nazis. But what stands out for me, and is very personal really, is the fact that they rescued and harbored 2 young Jewish boys, both of whom were reunited with your parents after the war. And one of whom, who is now 89 years old and has been a longstanding friend of the family, is coming to visit us in September. And it's a nice story. It's something I grew up with, and it's an amazing legacy. But at the same time, there are 2 things that I have begun to discover. One is there's a real, they call it a legacy burden. The burden of the legacy of those times, and it's a shadow that sort of follows you. And one of the ways that I've been able to deal with it and process it is to write about it. And I wrote a play, and I've given some talks to different groups and stuff like that. The other thing, and this is a little more tricky, which is we like to think of good guys and bad guys and heroes and villains and good versus evil, but there was a tremendous gray area in those times where the people who were heroic may also have been collaborative. Collaboration was something that, maybe meant survival. And I think this is now becoming more of a reality for the legacy of those times, which is to recognize the fact that many people had to put certain kind of moral code aside in order to survive.
Yeah.
And likewise, the people who risked their lives were also, on some level, endangering the lives of the people around them.
Yeah.
And it's a very complicated.
I agree. I think. I mean, thank you for sharing that. Have your parents been honored by Yad Vashem, or
What was that?
have your parents been honored by?
Yes.
Yeah.
Their name is on the wall at the Garden of Righteous.
Right. Yeah. No, that's important. I think you bring up a few really important points. One is that rescue. A lot of the people who I think did rescues suffered, as a lot of people did from the war, from what we would now call like post-traumatic stress, right? And also there were people who were in a position to help because of, maybe other things that were complicated, like Goering's brother helped people. The guy who tipped off the Danes was a member. He was a maritime specialist at member of the Nazi Party and part of the occupation government, but he wasn't an anti-Semite, or he certainly wasn't someone who thought that Jews should be exterminated. And because of his position, he was able to do this. But you could also say, he was part of the occupation and part of the government of part of Hitler's government. So, yeah, I think we have to also be very careful not to judge people, because when you think about, to be a rescuer, the further east you went, in like a place like Poland, if they caught you, not only did they kill you and the person you were trying to rescue, they killed your family.
Right.
And so it was like a very extreme thing to have expected, which is why I was talking about how the more realistic thing is what people around, like communities, can do. But I also, when I interviewed a lot of the children of rescuers, it was fascinating because it was a kind of just as people, right? And I did it to add texture to the book. Like, these were not saints. These were not people who were like Mother Teresa set out to, I'm going to devote my life. A lot of them were people who just ended up in these circumstances. And I mean, Varian Fry's son told me his father was completely bipolar. He didn't like his father. His father later became violent. There were like, even the little girl whose parents are these like kind of secular, they were the pastor. And she said, my parents, they were major figures in the nonviolent movement. They knew Gandhi, they knew Martin Luther King. She said, like they were doing all this rescue, but they like never came to my piano recital. And so like, these were complicated, people. And I agree with you. It was a gray area, and you have to be very careful, not to judge people. But I do think there's somewhere there where it tips over, where you kind of you see where someone made this decision to do the right thing, and that was rare. And most people didn't do it, your parents. But, yeah.
My mother was once asked in an interview, "Why did you do this?" And her response was, "That's not the right question. Why didn't more people do
Right,
this?"
That's right. And what I think you can see from places like Denmark is, if everybody did it, then you often had places like Denmark or Le Chambon or Bulgaria, all over Europe. It was like, that could happen. So, but your mother's response is very consistent also with the fact that people who rescue they felt very uncomfortable with being told like you did something great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like almost universal. Thank you for sharing that. It's really, yeah.
I wondered, I think I saw Zakynthos.
Yes.
And you mentioned there were some good places, and because I'm Greek, I thought they might mention, is that the island, the Zakynthos?
Yeah.
And why was it considered?
So they call it the Island of the Just, and it was part of the southern area, and it's in a Homeric book, the parade of ships. So it's been heroic a long time. But what happened there was the Nazis were they were so crazy that even at the end of the war, they would divert military resources to round up Jews, and they were going island to island to island. And the metropolitan there, so the priest, who had been very inspired by Damaskinos, they summoned the mayor. The Nazis arrived, they summoned the mayor, and they said, there were like 200 Jews on the island. And they said, we want the list of Jews within 24 hours. And the mayor went to the metropolitan, and they went back the next day, and they handed the German a piece of paper, and they said, this is the list of Jews that you asked for, and they'd written 2 names, their own. Yeah. And then the community sent all the Jews into the hills, and it was like the Nazis were furious, and then, but like, it was the waning days of the war, and the Allies, but they protected all the Jews for actually a lot, initially during the occupation, and then as they were really coming around them up, they really hit them, and so 100% survival rate there. So that's why. And then I don't know if there are any Jews because there were so few, but there were a few that moved to Israel that then came back and visited the families, and there was this famous thing where the guy said, "This is the Island of the Just." So it's just an example of 100% survival rate. Yes.
How did you choose the 10 people for your book?
Yeah. So it's not 10 people, it's 10 stories, because a lot of it was sort of groups of people. But I wanted to, so the answer is that, like, the original book was supposed to be 15 stories, and there was, my agent and publisher said, no one's gonna read this if you write 15 stories. But it was hard to choose them, but what I tried to do was look for different types of rescue, different places in Europe, different reasons people rescued. And also there were stories that just spoke to me that I thought were interesting as stories. You know, a lot of them are kind of cinematic, like a rescue in a circus, but it was meant to kind of be captured. And in my, I made a decision not to, like Nicky Winton, who's very well known, I did not include. I just wrote an article about him because his parents were Jewish, and I didn't want to have any. I didn't have any Jewish rescuers. So I talk in the introduction about probably another 20 stories that I would have written up, but I talk about them more in passing. But that was the hardest part of the book, was selecting them. But again, it was meant to give kind of a good sort of sampling of the types of things that went on.
Maybe one more question?
Why was the U.S. so unwilling to accept Jewish refugees? Is there enough time to answer
That's a very good question. Yeah, actually the book kind of grew out of another project I have about, my cousin worked for Morgenthau, was at Nuremberg, and so I spent a lot of time on that issue. I mean, it was, and what's interesting, right, is like you look at Barry and Fry, and the gift that those people gave to America were like single-handedly the art world shifted from Paris to New York, and all those writers went to Hollywood, and the scientists that worked on the Manhattan Project and all of that, right? But it was, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's hard to deny that there wasn't, it just was like anti-Semitism. It was anti-immigration sentiment in general. But when you actually look at the stuff where the Jews, like for example, there was an unknown, I wrote about this in the journal, there was an effort to bring the Jews to the Virgin Islands 2 weeks after Kristallnacht. The entire parliament voted unanimously. The governor general was a Columbia academic, and basically the State Department, Breckinridge Long, and the War Department decided to block it, and they called up FDR and pulled him out of the swimming pool and said, we can't. And all those Jews would have had, as stipulated, they would have had to stay off shore of the Virgin Islands, and they all had to have, sponsors, and they had to like put a certain amount of money in escrow. So there was no risk, and we never even filled our quotas. And there was this, when you look at the State Department and look at some of the memos that were sent by Long, or look at his, he was quite proud of it. I mean, he had been ambassador to Italy, loved Mussolini, and he basically said, we need to keep, these are undesirable people out, and we need to keep them out of our country. And that was the sentiment in the State Department. And I mean, Bingham's boss basically would say to him, like, first of all, why are you doing this? These are horrible people, and also the Germans are going to win the war. We're going to upset them. But I mean, it's really, and I think, the Ken Burns documentary, I think tells the story well, but I think he honestly let FDR off the hook. I think FDR was in a tough spot. I mean, you have to remember, like 3% of the American population wanted to, we were sympathetic to the British in 1941, but until Pearl Harbor, 3% wanted to intervene. So he was kind of balancing that, but like we could have done so much more. And then, there's a story where later in the war, my cousin's friends who were not Jewish ended up in the Treasury Department finding out about this, and they ended up setting up something called the War Refugees Board, which saved 150,000 Jews. But if we had done that from the beginning, we would have saved, millions. And it's not just the United States. I mean, there were other countries. I mean, nobody wanted, like very few countries would take in Jews. Philippines, which was part of our, actually did take in, but then the Japanese invaded. But, this is a very troubling issue, and it's hard to defend it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.